Welcome to the Filmlings podcast.
An uncommunicative podcast where we analyze all that goes into effective filmmaking.
I'm Jonathan.
And I'm Alex.
And this is episode 167, an overview of tragic cinema part 5, Tragedies of Misunderstanding.
This one's real sad.
Yeah, my mom's been listening through all the podcasts. Hi, Mom. And she was like, these last few episodes have been really sad. And I was like, you mean the tragedy series? Those episodes have been really sad? Yeah, sorry about that. But yes, we're almost done. But it has been a sad journey.
Yeah, nothing says the holidays, it's holiday time of year, like a bunch of more sad movies.
Yeah, did not really plan that out. But we're wrapping up, and then at the end, we'll let you guys know about a little bit what we're doing next year, which is comedy, spoilers. But we do have some more sad movies to get through. And before we get into that, a little bit more theory, because that's what we're doing here. We're, again, basing the series kind of loosely around Aristotle's Poetics. But I did want to throw in a little bit more of a etymology, definitioning of the term tragedy, because we had a little bit of a tiff over this in the last episode. So, a little brief history of tragedy. We've been talking about Aristotle, Aristotle's Poetics is basically the first work of any kind of literary criticism known ever. So this is kind of where we start. So we've been talking about this, what tragedy meant in Greece. And just to give a little bit more context on that point, in ancient Greece, there were basically two kinds of narrative arts. One was non-performative and one was performative. So the non-performative arts were broken down into epics and lyrical poetry. So epics are like the Odyssey. They are grand stories. These were in the oral tradition. They eventually started getting written down. And then lyric poetry is like songs and stuff like that. Now, when they started performing those stories, those categories kind of transformed into what were known as tragedy and comedy. And so those who wrote epics started writing what became tragedies, and those who wrote lyric poems, generally speaking, started writing what were known as the comedies. And as Aristotle lays out, the comedy was the stories of the ridiculous species of like the ugly, but like ugly in a way that doesn't hurt anyone. It's just kind of a shock factor kind of a thing. So this is the buffoons, the ignoble stuff like we've been talking about. And then the tragedy was the stories of nobility and stuff like that. And then there was also the satyr play, which I don't fully understand. It is described as like a cross between a narrative, or like a cross between a tragedy, in that it was like a grand story, but also with a happy ending, putting it and some comedic elements, but also just like a ton of sexual innuendos and references.
Yeah, it's safe.
So that was a third category, I guess. So then in the Middle Ages, these terms kind of expanded a little bit, and tragedies became much more gruesome and macabre. So in the Roman world, these are known as the Senecan plays, and those are what influenced what is most commonly recognizable for us today is Shakespeare's Titus Andronicus. Was basically him imitating those types of stories, and Titus Andronicus is Shakespeare's most brutal and gruesome story.
Yeah, it's a fun time.
And then comedies became anything with a happy ending, or anything that kind of moved from the low or the base to the high and the lofty, rather than simply depicting the ridiculous or the absurd. Hence Dante's Divine Comedy. And there's a lot more that goes into the definition of that, in terms of also like in Dante's time, if you wrote in the common language, it was basically considered a comedy, just because you were writing for regular people. So the fact that he wrote the comedy in Italian rather than Latin just by default made it a comedy. But also just because of the magnitude of that work, it helped to expand the term into something that moves from the lowest to the highest, even though the comedy, although it has funny elements in it, is not necessarily like an absurd or satirical type of a work. Then in Elizabethan times, there was the first of what are now considered domestic tragedies. And that's a lot of what we've been talking about in this series. What's a lot of the kind of modern drama could fall in this category of domestic tragedies. These are tragedies of everyday people whose downfall is just kind of a personal issue. It affects them or their family, rather than in Greek tragedies, when we're talking about kings and we're talking about generals and stuff like that. Like, the downfall of those people affected themselves and their family and basically the entire state, or like whole political factions and stuff like that. So yeah, that is part of what Aristotle was saying in terms of like taking everything to their ultimate. Basically was saying that the more downfall happens in your story, the better it is, because the bigger something is, the better it is. And so if you can have a king who falls and then the whole kingdom falls because of him, that makes your tragedy that much more impactful. But then, we start getting around Shakespeare's time, where you start getting stories of just everyday people having these stories that just impact them in tragic ways. And Arthur Miller kind of coined the term in 1949, or at least defined the parameters of these domestic tragedies in an essay he wrote called Tragedy and the Common Man. And again, we've been talking about these in almost every one of these episodes. These are kind of falling in that domestic tragedy category. But in modern times, we also have this thing where we love to just like cross genres, and we love to mix things up. And as the proliferation of art and storytelling has been democratized more and more, those clear lines between genres and arts even has become fuzzier and fuzzier and fuzzier, to the point where there was at least one book on literary theory called The Death of Tragedy by a guy named George Steiner, which outlines the classic definitions of tragedy based on Aristotle and others, and why that basically doesn't apply anymore. And that's kind of what we got into on the episode last time.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I guess people just aren't writing what they wrote 4,000 years ago.
Yeah, and part of democratizing art is that like you don't have everyone looking up to an Aristotle or a philosopher of like what art is for setting the bounds and the standards. There's no standards, right? So everyone kind of fills it with their own interpretations of what art or what genre should be. And so then it becomes more difficult to classify. And that's why you can scroll through Netflix like endlessly, just looking at their various classifications and cross classifications. That is like, I didn't even know that was a genre of movie. That's also like, there's just whole categories of letterbox lists that are like, a guy with a gun who walks around with a puppy. It's like, that's a genre now?
Yeah. Ask Keanu Reeves about it.
So to wrap up our series, though, where I'm still trying to add some classifications to these things, we were talking about, last time we talked about tragedies of betrayal, which is man versus man conflicts, where there is an intentional betrayal. There's an intentional harming of one person by the other person, and what the effects of that are and how that comes about. Here, tragedies of misunderstanding are tragedies in which something, there's a tragic element to them, but it is not necessarily an intentionally harmful act. And so these are based on like competing desires or competing considerations, and the outfalls of those. And in the term understanding, before we get into these, I just want to kind of talk about, this is going to apply both to like a cognitive comprehension. There will be elements of like, I just literally don't understand you. I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know like where you're coming from. And then there's also a secondary definition of understanding, which has to do with compassion and sympathy, where we say that someone is understanding or behaves in an understanding way. And that's going to play a really big role in a lot of these. That's kind of the core of what this is going to be about, is kind of where characters ought to express compassion or sympathy and whether or not they actually do. And of course, sympathy is closely related to pity, which, if we go back to the beginning of this series, Aristotle's two pillars of tragedy are stories that evoke pity or fear, and/or fear. And so I think that we're going to get to some of those really core ideas of like what makes a tragedy when we're talking about these stories that are built around this idea of building sympathy and where sympathy should and can be expressed.
Sympathy for the Devil is the song that popped into my head right then. But not what we're talking about. I don't know why. There are some devil-like characters, though, in I think all of the films we're talking about today. So, well, maybe not the Farewell. I don't think there's any devils in the Farewell.
No.
And the other two, there is arguably devils.
Some of them are more sympathetic devils than others.
That's true. That's very true. But let's talk about the films that we'll be talking about today before we talk about the films that we'll be talking about today. First up is A Woman Under the Influence from 1974, directed by John Cassavetes, someone we talked about on the podcast a lot before, but we've never talked about one of his directorial efforts, and this is one of them. It was directed by him, written by him, starring Gina Rowlands and Peter Falk, with cinematography by Mitch Bright and Al Rubin, and music by Bo Harwood. Then we'll be talking about The Elephant Man from 1980, which, fun fact, was executive produced by Mel Brooks. I did not realize that until I watched it this time. His name is nowhere near it. He kept his name off of it very intentionally because Mel Brooks's reputation is like satirical comedy. And so he didn't want anybody to associate that with The Elephant Man before watching it because it is not comedic at all. Yeah. But it was directed by David Lynch with a screenplay by Christopher DeVore, Eric Berggren, and David Lynch himself. This has been based upon the true life story of John Merrick, known as the Elephant Man, and not upon the Broadway play of the same title or any other fictional account. Actually based on the books The Elephant Man and Other Reminiscences by Frederick Treves, who's the doctor in the story, and in part on The Elephant Man, A Study in Human Dignity by Ashley Montagu. And obviously, yes, it is actually based on the real-life human, John Merrick, who had maybe a combination of diseases that no one ever had.
Apparently, no one still
really figured
knows
it out. Yeah, it's still a mystery what he really had, but it was a combination of some genetic diseases, more than likely, that interacted in this specific way to give him these very specific, like, phenotypical differences in his appearance that made him the Elephant Man and makes him one of the more obscure but notable members of the 27 Club. Jonathan, do you know what the 27 Club is?
I have no idea what that means.
It's actually more talking about like famous people from the later part of the 20th century. I think James Dean is in it.
What club has John Merrick and James Dean in it?
And Amy Winehouse. It's famous people who died at the age of 27.
Oh, interesting.
And John Merrick was famous and died at the age of 27. I just had that. I was reading his Wikipedia page and I was like, hey, he's a member of the 27 Club. That's weird.
That is interesting. Well, yeah, a side note, because there's an opposite club, I guess. In Frank Capra's autobiography, he goes through this whole list of people who became famous when they were 26. So, like, there's a 26 club of people who, like, had their big break when they were 26, which includes people like, he had a lot of, like, scientists. I think Orson Welles is probably in that group.
I was about to say the one that springs into mind is Orson Welles.
But yeah, that's a sad pairing of like the famous at 26 and dead at 27 clubs.
I don't think there's a lot of crossover there.
Probably that Venn diagram is not very crossed over.
But yes, that's just an odd observation that I noticed while watching this. And I think it is also one of the things that I think humanized, because I reread his Wikipedia, like John Merrick's Wikipedia page again before
technically
watching the movie.
Joseph Merrick.
Yeah, Joseph Merrick. And it also, like, just reading simple facts about like his birthday, his death day, like how old he was when he died, like serves to like rehumanize him in the way that you don't immediately get when you see him.
Yeah.
Because your brain just doesn't react in that way of, oh, you're a human. But he is. And that's one of the core tragedies of the film. But yes, it stars John Hurt as the Elephant Man himself, Anthony Hopkins as the aforementioned Frederick Treves, and Bancroft, who this is actually the film where she met Mel Brooks on, and they would go on to have collaborations in the future. Oh. And John Gielgud as well.
We talked about John Gielgud back in the Laurence Olivier episode, because John Gielgud and Laurence Olivier, and I forget who the third is, but they were like the three knights of the British theater for a long time. They were big names.
And if you need somebody to gill well, John Gielgud is your guy. Cinematography for this movie was done by Freddie Francis, and music by John Morris. And finally, we'll talk about The Farewell from 2019. Had to get an A24 movie in here somewhere. Directed by Lulu Wang, written by Lulu Wang, based on an actual lie, and a very common cultural practice that is discussed in the film. Starring Awkwafina, Sima, Diana Lin, and Zhao Shushin. Cinematography by Anna Francesca Solano, and music by Alex Weston. You wouldn't think I'd mispronounce my own name, but here we are. And that's all of the bio we'll give you before we jump into the movies. So let's take it away. Jason, go!
A Woman Under the Influence from 1974. Nick, a construction foreman, lives in the Los Angeles suburbs with his 3 kids and loving wife, Mabel. After missing a planned date night with Mabel, for which she had sent the kids to stay with her mother for a day, Nick brings his whole construction crew home for a spaghetti dinner cooked by Mabel. Mabel is warm with the crew, although some of her behavior is odd. When she invites one of the men to dance with her, Nick snaps at her, causing her to become sad and confused. After another incident one day, when Mabel is hosting a birthday party and has all the children reenact the ending of Swan Lake, one of the neighborhood parents becomes uncomfortable leaving his children with Mabel and ends up getting into a physical fight with Nick. That evening, prompted by his mother, Nick calls Mabel's mental health doctor, who takes Mabel away to an institution for treatment. While she is away, Nick struggles to cope with his decision, in one case getting into an altercation with a coworker, and in another forcing the children to skip school and go to the beach. When Mabel returns 6 months later with a very different and more subdued personality, Nick is faced with a discrepancy between his ideal version of his wife and the full reality of who she is.
Yeah, this is a movie, Jonathan, that is, I think, really harkens back to something you were saying in your opening spiel about what makes these kinds of tragedies tragic. And it's the idea of like, I just don't know where you're coming from.
Yeah.
And the main character in this movie is very clearly dealing with like not one, but probably a few different mental health issues going on at once that are all stacked up on top of each other.
Who are you considering the main character of this film?
I feel like
it's tricky.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to say who the main character of the film is. I mean, she is the woman under the influence, but she also is so lost in this bundle of mental health issues that she doesn't have a lot of agency. So it's almost not. It's one of the rare instances of a structure in a stage play or screenplay where the main character is kind of one who's acted upon rather than acting against the world. And then we kind of have to experience that.
Yeah, and I think that this is a little bit of a special case because of her condition, which is not specified and is not necessarily important. Part of what I took away from this film is like, and just by reading the descriptions, I thought I wasn't exactly sure where this film was going before it started. I thought that it might be one of those like, you know, this is a normal woman who's just stepped on by all the men in her life. But no, this is a woman with actual mental health issues. And because there is a fundamental lack of some amount of social understanding on her part,
Yeah, nobody has like the toolkit to deal with it.
Right.
Like
She requires
even
more.
the doctor doesn't know. Like nobody knows how to take care of her. Nobody knows what's going on. And there's people who clearly love her and care for her, including her husband.
Yeah.
Who are probably just at their wits' end, and because they don't know what to do anymore, act out because of it. And it's really sad and heartbreaking to see, because it kind of is like an example of how a microcosm example of the mental health space in the not so distant past. Like, we've gotten much better at it now, being able to talk about mental health and understand it and communicate with people and help people and loved ones who are going through something like this that's really complicated, or getting them the help they need, or having a more robust mental health industry to support them. But in the 70s, in blue collar Los Angeles suburbs, not the case. And there is a lot of suffering that is caused by it. And you can see the toll that it doesn't just take on her, but the toll that it takes on her husband, even though he does really awful things. And obviously on her kids. Those kids are going to be scarred for life. And oh man, it's just so sad. Jonathan, why are all the movies so sad?
It's to help us avoid these sad situations in our own life, Alex, if that helps you.
Well, hopefully, yes. Although I will say, not to bring up another major point too fast, but this is John Cassavetes. He's a very theater-based guy. Mm-hmm. Some of his movies are very explicitly about stage plays and putting on stage plays. But like Opening Night is a really pretty good example. But a lot of his films are structured in the way that a stage play would be structured. So notice in this movie, almost everything is set in and around the house. It's very small. A lot of the scenes are very long. It's not very plot heavy. There's maybe a few key significant plot points that happen over the course of the film. But most of it is performance oriented and about these really long dialogue scenes and these slow tonal shifts over the course of these scenes that kind of like crescendo and sharp points towards the end, and then examining and re-examining characters from different angles from scene to scene to scene, which is a pretty good way to deal with this complicated idea of a woman with very complex mental health issues, but nobody understands them and everybody suffers because of it.
Yeah. And also, like, just to point out that this is like peak American New Wave. So the lighter camera documentary style was becoming more of a thing, partially in thanks to John Cassavetes, but also Cassavetes. I think pretty much all of Cassavetes' films were like self-funded. Him and Falk and maybe one or two others, like, kind of just pooled up the money. Once they had enough money, they just made a movie, and so he had complete control over it and stuff like that. But it also, kind of gives you limitations on what you're able to do. So that, but with his theatrical background and all of that, it definitely helps. And it should be noted that Gina Rowlands and John Cassavetes were married. They were Gina Rowlands was John Cassavetes' only wife for his whole life, and then I think she remarried after he died at some point. But they were like a rock solid.
That's impressive for a Broadway person.
Yeah, I know. They were a rock solid couple for like majority of their lives, all of Cassavetes' life. But I think it's really interesting to see like the way that he directs her in this film, and just because she has such a huge like performative weight to carry in this movie. And I was watching an interview that's on the Criterion extras, but he basically said the guy was asking him about basically like, did Gina like watch someone with mental health issues? Did she like study it? Did she study a particular condition to put together her performance? And he was like, no. Basically that's not the point of the film. So it wasn't like, we're going to talk about autism or we're going to talk about Down syndrome or whatever the case may be. It's really just about this misunderstanding between the man and the woman, which can be present in any marriage, but this is kind of just taken to a stark contrast. so that you can see those really sharp edges very clearly. Although elements of this relationship appear in pretty much any kind of relationship. And so, but I do think it's really interesting.
If you ask Sean Connery, they do.
What does that mean?
Nothing wrong with a good open hand slap.
Oh my God. We don't need to bring in Marnie.
Yeah, where do you think he learned it?
But yeah, one thing that kind of getting to, again, with Mabel's character, Gina Rowland's character of Mabel, is that since she doesn't have complete social awareness or understanding, she requires more understanding from the people around her. And part of the tragedy is that she's not surrounded with people who are kind of trained, or they don't really have mental categories for having that kind of understanding. And so, like, part of the tragedy is just the fact that she got married to Nick in the first place. But it's also a mixed bag, right? Because he does love her. And I think that's really important when you're watching the film. And I think that the focus on performance helps to drive all these contrasts and these like unspoken elements. Like, it makes it really clear through Falk and Rowland's performances is that he does love her, but he doesn't even know what he wants. Like, he doesn't understand himself well enough, which becomes very clear at the end. You can't have it both ways. You can't have the parts of your wife that you want and not the parts that you don't want. You have to take your wife as a whole person and everything that goes with that. But that doesn't really click with him. And that's what she starts to try to communicate by the end. So, okay, as we transition to that, because there's kind of a clear divide in the film. There's a lot of lead up of like learning who Mabel is. The audience has to get to understand her through her subjective experience. So we have a majority of the film is from her perspective. And at first it's really confusing because she does something really strange at the very beginning. And then we're trying to figure out why she does that and why she seems to not understand what she did until we come to this understanding of her mental illness. And then there's a shift when Nick sends her off to get treatment, which we find out later is like partially at least shock therapy. So we follow her.
It's a bad rap, by the way. Electroshock therapy has come a long way in the past few decades. So it often gets a bad rap in movies, but it can be quite effective and not nearly as traumatizing as it appears in mid 20th century movies.
Well, to my understanding too, it's kind of like dentistry. It's like, I think nowadays they put you under when they do the treatment, and when they first started doing it, I don't think they did that. So I think there was a lot of pain involved that is not involved anymore.
Yeah. Immediately remembering all of the Western movies with over the top dentistry scenes where people are like strapped down to like rip out a tooth. Because that was the solution to everything in the Old West, is to just rip out a tooth before they realized, developed like technology to treat it, which is actually a pretty good analogy for how mental health used to be treated. We don't know how to handle this. Let's just cut off part of your brain with a lobotomy. Oh, wait, we can treat this with medicine and some inventive treatments and some talk therapy. Oh, wow, that's way better and less invasive. So,
yeah,
medicine takes a while, but it can come along.
And yeah, again, the treatment is not necessarily the point either. But there's this moment where after she's sent off, we switch perspectives to Peter Falk and his Nick. And then we're following him and kind of how he's coping with the fact that he sent her off, and then how he copes with her returning. So I think that's really interesting. And now that I'm thinking about it, it's almost like the POV of the whole film is the POV of the house. It's like what the house sees of the family, because once she leaves, we stay in the house with Nick, and now he's the only one. And at the beginning, we stay with her in the house while Nick is working and she's left alone. And so we're seeing how these characters interact when they're left alone without the other, and then what happens when they're reunited again at various points.
It kind of harkens back to the stage play origins of like the people who made it, and how in the idea that like in the theater, the audience is a very physical part of the set,
but also static.
They're static. They exist. They're in the room with the story as it's being told. So they're, in a lot of ways, like they kind of felt like the main character. The audience feels like the main character to me over the course of the movie, even though they're as passive as the poor woman is in some ways. But you're kind of you're watching everything, you're observing everything. Everything centers around your experience of it because you're stuck in this house, and so you must experience it all.
Another thought that I had when just thinking about Cassavetes' style is like that American New Wave, like very naturalistic, almost documentary type style. It almost makes this film feel like the audience is watching a home movie of their family from years ago.
No, that's very Cassavetes. All of his stuff feels like that. It's really cool. It's a very unique style, especially compared to even other New Wave filmmakers of the time. But it can take some adjustment.
Yeah. But when we talk about spectacle and how the spectacle affects the experience, like that is a really interesting like way to draw you in, especially to this story. It's almost like you're watching your mom and dad fight from like decades ago, but it like makes you feel like you are part of that experience, even though you're detached from it.
Yeah.
But speaking of that, the shift at the end when she comes back, and there is that moment of peripety that we've been talking about, this reversal, or this unexpected twist, which is that Nick has sent his wife away to get treatment. He wants her to be better. He wants her to be what he keeps saying is just be yourself, which doesn't mean what it sounds like it means. And the discovery that goes along with that peripety is that that's not what he wanted. Like the treatment is not actually what he wanted, because she comes back and she's very passive. Like her personality has been very boisterous. It's been a very casual, very forward.
At times very warm and friendly.
Yes. But it's like unfiltered is probably a good way to put it. And he likes that sometimes and he doesn't like it other times. And so he thinks that therapy is going to make only the parts of her that he likes stay. But she comes back and she just basically has no personality and she's just kind of very dull. And then he tells her to be herself, and then she does, and he doesn't like it. And so there's this conflict within himself of realizing that the treatment is not what he actually wanted for her. Like he kind of has to come to terms with the fact that he wants all of her, the good and the bad parts. There's a very strange connection that I made with this film. I think it would be a really interesting double feature if just for the endings between this and Harvey. And I don't know if you remember Harvey well enough. Do you remember the ending of Harvey?
Not off the top of my head.
Okay.
I mean, does someone else see the imaginary rabbit or something?
Actually, yes, but that's besides the point. So Harvey is a story of Jimmy Stewart, who is a lovable drunk who has this best friend who is an invisible 6'3" white rabbit named Harvey. And everyone loves him, but they're also like, okay, you're a little bit crazy because you shouldn't be seeing this invisible rabbit. And this is clearly in the comedy category, just to make that clear if you've never seen it. And at the end, they realize that there's this treatment. He can get a shot and he won't see his imaginary friend anymore. And they're like, good, he'll be normal. And then they are waiting for him to get the treatment, and the taxi driver comes in and he's like, oh yeah, I see them come in and out of this place, and they come in and they're all happy-go-lucky and it's all sunshine and roses. And then they get back in the car and they're just like normal people, nasty, mean, normal people. And then his aunt and niece realize, oh my gosh, that's not what we want. We want him to be the way that he is, even if he sees this crazy, if he acts crazy and has this white rabbit friend. And so there's kind of the same thing where it's like they realize that the treatment is not what they want because they want the good and the bad parts of his personality. The difference is when the discovery happens. So like we talked about with discovery in the last episode, the discovery happens before the treatment in Harvey. In Woman Under the Influence, the discovery happens after the treatment, after it's like too late and her personality has been changed, that he realizes, I didn't actually want to change your personality. I just wanted you to calm down sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah. I wonder too, how much of it is that, how much she's changed over time, because one has to assume that's gotten worse after, having 3 kids and the marriage goes on and, she's not getting the help she needs. It gets worse and worse and worse. And also, presumably, if she was acting the way she is now with the swings as extreme as they are, that they wouldn't have gotten together in the first place. So maybe some element of it was there to begin with, but it's gotten worse over time. So I wonder, too, how much of it is wanting someone to be like they were 10, 20 years ago and not accepting that people change over the years. Granted, in this way, in this instance, it's a negative change due to untreated mental health issues. But, I wonder how much of it is that, because that is a pretty normal and common thing in relationships too. When you're with somebody for decade after decade after decade, like they're going to change, you're going to change, your model of them in your brain has to update and change too, and accommodate both the negative and positive changes within that in order to maintain a healthy relationship. Otherwise, like, you drift and you get confused because the person that you see now isn't no longer the person that you remember, because you haven't been paying attention and or been present, which seems like it could be an issue in this relationship, is just him not being present for huge chunks of time because he's off working so long. So yeah, I don't know. There are elements of it that are like specifically extreme because every movie is fundamentally hyperbolic, but there are also elements of it that are relatable, I think, to a lot of situations that aren't as extreme.
Yeah. As a side note, before we got married, I got a piece of advice that goes along with what you were saying, which is that when you get married, men expect their wife to not change and then get disappointed when they do, and wives hope that their husbands will change and then get disappointed when they don't.
I mean, I'm not married, but that sounds accurate.
So keep that in mind.
I mean, I know plenty of people in good marriages, but I also know plenty of people in not so good marriages where it's like, do you even like each other?
How did this happen? Yeah.
How did this happen? Like, but also you have to assume that, like, much like the couple in this movie here, that, 10, 20 years ago when they did get married, it made sense, but they just haven't, they haven't installed the software updates over the past few years or been reading like the operating instruction updates or been paying attention. And suddenly they go down to use their iPhone, so to speak. And they're like, I don't remember any of these buttons. This isn't what I bought.
Yeah. There's another thing that I want to bring up is that there's an interesting element because, again, it's important to understand that they do love each other. Nick does love Mabel. But there is a very strong element of guilt that's kind of sprinkled throughout this film. And there's an interesting relationship between guilt and sympathy, I think. Because you have this aspect of, first of all, in like Mabel's parents, one of the first things that we see when the mom comes back with the kids is that the mom almost feels like she's apologizing to Nick for the way that her daughter is. Like, oh, I'm sorry she's like that. Is there anything I can do for you? Are you okay, Nick? Even though Nick is the one being harsh. But every time Nick is harsh with Mabel, he feels bad about it. And so there's this, like, when he expresses a lack of sympathy, he feels guilt afterwards. And so by the time that gets to the point where he's so fed up that he sends her off to have treatment, he's just like shot through with guilt for sending her away. And so he starts doing, like, he beats up the guy at work, or rather pushes him down a hill, who makes a comment about it. He takes the kids to the beach in the most unfun beach vacation ever. because he feels guilty for taking their mom away. And then he tries to throw a party for her because he feels guilty for taking her away from her friends and like wanting it to be just like that one time that they all had spaghetti and they were having fun. And then he ruined the mood. And so he feels guilt for that. So it's like there's so much just guilt that's built up through this. He has this some amount of understanding that he had a lack of sympathy or a lack of pity for his wife, but he just keeps doing it again and again, even after he has felt the guilt for doing it in the first place.
He's stuck in a way not too dissimilar from the way she's stuck.
Yeah.
And I think in the way that she's confused by her own behavior and everything that's going around, he's also confused by his own behavior and everything else that's going on. Like he knows what he wants, I think in one regard, like he knows.
Well, he definitely knows what he wants,
image,
but he can't reconcile that what he wants is not a reality. He wants a fantasy version.
That's what I'm getting at. He wants something that no longer exists and he doesn't know how to get back there. So he's flailing, essentially trying to get there, sometimes quite literally. And in the course of that dissonance is finding a lot of suffering and tragedy.
Yeah. And he also has this weird paradox where he becomes over-controlling at moments where he should be understanding, and he becomes really passive at moments where he should kind of take the reins. Like when he yells at Mabel when they're having spaghetti and she wants to dance with one of his friends, and he shouts at her and then feels bad about it. And then later when he invites all of his friends over for the party when she's about to come back from the hospital and then realizes that was a bad idea, but he can't send them away. And he's like, Mom, you send them away. If you don't want them here, you send them away. So then he just becomes like really passive. But it's also even Mabel's dad, who, when she comes back from treatment, I do want to talk about this because there's like a really pivotal moment where, like I said, she comes back, she's very passive. Nick says, be yourself. And so she does, she starts acting out. But she's like making comments that he doesn't like. So then he yells at her again and he's like, be yourself. And then in her mind, she's like, I'm being myself, but then he doesn't want me to be myself, but then he tells me to be myself. And the way that she expresses that is she asks her dad to stand up, and then she asks her dad to sit down, and then she asks her dad to stand up, and then she asks her dad to sit down. And he's like, I don't understand what you want from me. And then his wife is like, don't you get what she's trying to tell you? And it's this beautiful moment of like putting into reality a feeling that she can't express. And that's the moment of discovery for them and for the audience. And then after that, Nick goes off at her again. And then the dad goes, then he feels bad and he feels like he has to defend his daughter, but then he just leaves like 2 seconds later. But I do think that moment, in terms of like a constructed moment in the film, is a really beautiful way of expressing what the film is about without using like a monologue. It's using an action to convey how Mabel is feeling.
Yeah. Oh man. Dude, I'm sad. Can we move on to the next movie?
Okay, let's move on.
I'm sure it'll be happier.
Well, okay, the last thing that I do want to mention before we move off is that the ending is not completely sad in this film. Because after everything that happens and he hits her again and whatever, and then they start getting ready for bed, and then they get excited, and they're like getting happy and getting their room ready, and there's like joy on their faces. And it's a little bit inexplicable. What did you make of that at like the very last shot of the film?
Well, that part feels simple and familiar to them. So I think that feels familiar enough to both of them that it's approaching what they want and what they envision for their lives. So it is joy. And I think to some extent too, that it's not like either one of them wants to stop working on it. I think they're both just so ill-equipped at working on what they're working on that that's where a lot of the suffering comes from. But It's not a tragedy because they don't want to help each other and they don't want to get better and they don't love each other. It's a tragedy because they do all those things and they do work together and they do want to love each other and be better for each other, but they just don't know how. That's the sad part of the movie. And I think that's what we're seeing there at the end, is that they are a loving couple. They're just really bad at it. And it's sad that they're bad at it.
Yeah. That's kind of the takeaway that I got too. And the way that I was thinking about it is that there's like a tug of war between these two people who are kind of understanding things in different ways. But even that tug of war, even though it's a struggle, it is, to go back to our philosophical terms, a type of agon. It results in a stasis. And so there is still a solid relationship there, even though they are pulling in different directions to some extent. It doesn't necessarily mean that one or the other loses. It's like, that's just kind of how it is. And they're going to have to keep going back and forth. But as long as they can maintain an equilibrium, they're going to be okay.
Maybe they'll keep struggling along and they're not completely unhappy. Where they're at. It's
a struggle and it's exhausting, but they haven't lost yet.
And ostensibly, I think, too, they are maybe better together than they are apart, which isn't saying a lot, but I really think they would be worse off if they didn't have each other.
Right. And it's like, sure, maybe Mabel should have ended up with like a really sensitive, like therapist type guy, but
I don't know. But in the 1970s, I don't know if that would have helped.
Right. But I'm just saying, like, ultimately, there is kind of a silver lining in that, yeah, Nick does love her and he will defend her, even if he goes about it the wrong way sometimes. Like, he's still there for her.
Yeah. Yeah.
Probably out of all the blue collar guys around, she got the right one.
Yeah. 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 Definitely sub-ideal, but that's most people's realities. Actually, sub-ideal is just like everyone's reality, really.
Okay, a little bit of a silver lining. Now we can move on to the Elephant Man. Jason, set us up.
The Elephant Man from 1980. In Victorian London, a man named John Merrick, who was born with severe physical deformities, is displayed as an attraction called the Elephant Man in a traveling freak show. When he is discovered by a local surgeon named Frank Treves, Treves pays Merrick's owner, the ringmaster, to let him display Merrick to colleagues as a unique case study in a lecture series. When Merrick returns, the ringmaster beats him so badly he must send for Treves again for medical treatment. While again at the London hospital in Treves' care, Merrick recites the 23rd Psalm from memory, causing Treves and the head of the hospital to realize that he is not mentally impaired as they had previously assumed. This gives Treves cause to advocate that Merrick be given a permanent room in the hospital to keep him out of his abusive situation in the freak show. The word of Merrick's unusual medical condition and his sensitive and intelligent personality is soon spread through the press, which quickly presents Merrick with a series of upper-class visitors interested to meet the so-called Elephant Man. While Treves wonders if he might have created a new version of a freak show attraction for the rich, Merrick begins to gain the self-confidence to finally understand that he is indeed a human being with the same rights and dignity as anyone else.
So this is an interesting form of misunderstanding, which is kind of the ultimate form of misunderstanding, which is it deals a lot with intentional misunderstanding, otherwise known as prejudice. Is this like...
As what?
Prejudice.
Prejudice. Okay, yes.
It is this like intentional unwillingness to understand out of some kind of fear of the strange or the atypical. I mean, there's a specific line where he says people fear what they don't understand, and that's really kind of the core of the film a little bit. It's contrasting the people who don't want to understand and the people who actually do want to understand and get to know who this human being is, rather than just gawk at an anomaly.
Yeah, I mean, pretty much. And it's a unique case, especially when you mention prejudice, because we're used to thinking about prejudice on this wide scale. Mm-hmm. Like, you know, somebody who, whether it be like race or religion or gender or so on and so forth. But this is very specific. So it kind of catches everybody off guard, regardless of who you are, because you haven't seen somebody with this.
Yeah.
mostly because it's just incredibly rare. It's one of the only documented cases of whatever it is. We don't even know what it is.
Right.
So it really is a test of like, hey, when confronted with the unknown, can you still find the humanity within? I mean, even for part as sympathetic as like the Dr. Treves is, for of the first chunk of the movie, he just thinks that this person is an idiot. He feels sympathy for him, but he doesn't feel empathy with him, I don't think. Not until he realizes that he can talk and interact, does he start to recognize, or I think really recognize the humanity within him.
Yeah. And Treves it's a hard case too, because especially from Treves's point of view, because, say he was also had a severe mental illness or mental handicap along with his physical handicap, there would have been very little that Treves could have done. So it was only at the point where he understood that, there is a way to communicate and interact with him, that there becomes now options for how to help him and how to provide an outlet for that sympathy that he feels for him. And that's an interesting development to watch happen as Treves starts to understand that.
Yeah. I mean, that journey to understanding is a big portion of most of the characters' reactions in the movie. I think, in a way, and it almost kind of goes back to what you were saying with who's the main character in the previous movie, Jonathan. The Elephant Man could be the main character. I think Treves is more likely the main character in the movie.
I think so.
But
too.
even then, there kind of is like this dilution of it, because the really like the structure of the film is based around how multiple different people react to the Elephant Man and what they take from the experience of seeing something like that. Do they just see a financial opportunity in him? Do they look down on him and abuse him like the night watchman? Or do they try to seek to find the humanity in him? And even some of the people who look to find the humanity in him look at it from different angles. Like some people, like the doctor's looking at it almost from a medical's perspective first. The actress who develops interest almost comes like one of the audience members would at the freak show. Just out of curiosity first before meeting him, and then connecting that curiosity into humanity. Or
I don't know. I might disagree about her specifically, but I think what is shown later is that the kind of social circle that Treves tries to build for Merrick becomes a kind of substitute high-class version of the freak show.
Yeah, it does. And even Treves starts to question that himself. But I think at the end of the day, especially because I think immediately following his questioning of that is when the abduction from the hospital happens. I think Treves realizes that there was far more humanity and dignity in the experience that he was garnering for Merrick than there was beforehand. It could have been far worse.
Yeah.
And for anyone who was wondering, the abduction from the hospital never happened in real life. That was a hyperbolic anecdote inserted into the movie for drama.
And it sucks. I hate it's so bad.
It's so mean. It's so sad. I skipped through it a bit this time, to be honest, because I've seen this movie a few times.
It is so hard.
And it's just sad and bad. And I'm like, I don't really want to see that again.
I will say just while we're on that, I think what it does for the film is, especially in relation to your question of who's the main character, because I do think that struggle and change in the doctor from trying to understand what is the best way to help Merrick is how he changes. But there's also a journey that Merrick has to go on himself, which is going from essentially seeing himself as a worthless freak show attraction to seeing himself as a person. And that abduction scene ends with him yelling at all these people who've never seen him before, "I am not an animal, I am a human being." And I think that is a moment of understanding for Merrick himself, who has to express in words out loud, his own dignity that he has found thanks to the help of Treves.
Yeah. Because I mean, even at I mean, he can talk. He needs to practice at it a little bit at first, but he can talk, but when the movie starts, but he doesn't.
Yeah.
For a long time. And I think part of that is that the way he's experienced life, he begins to believe that the way he's been treated is the way he deserves to be treated. And there's even that really heartbreaking moment where you realize that his mom, where he's talking to the doctor and meets the doctor's wife for the first time, and you realize that his mom had abandoned him as a baby. And he talks about how, you know, he had tried so hard to be a good boy, but all these bad things kept happening. And oh man, that's so sad.
Yeah.
That's so sad. Even when he feels guilty because he's telling the story, and then the doctor's wife starts crying just because it's so sad, but he thinks maybe he said something to make her cry, which technically he did, but it's nothing he said. It's not like he said anything rude, but it's just, again, one of those moments
her understanding
of like,
where he's coming from.
Yeah. Of this purely innocent soul who's been made to suffer through no fault of his own. And it's heartbreaking.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's kind of like if I had to pick one word to define all of the tragedies of this episode, heartbreaking is probably the one.
Yeah.
Because there's nothing you can really do about it. It's nothing the person did to earn it or to bring it about. No hubris. It just happened.
Yeah. And that there's definitely crossover in this one very strongly with tragedies of fate or circumstance.
Yeah, but we're not arguing about whether or not someone could fit on a door. So there's progress.
There is progress.
God, if I never watch Titanic again, it'll be too soon.
Oh gosh. Yeah, but I think that that heartbreaking element is that that evocation of pity. Again, that is one of the which makes these like very core and close to what the aim of tragedy is. It's building up that pity, that heartbreak within us. And so yeah, and again, talking about how that moment where we hear where Treves' wife hears the story of Merrick, and as she comes to understand his background, his what kind of a life he's been led to live, which is part of like also the moment of the I love John Gielgud's character in this, he's the head of the hospital that Treves works at, and he's making a bunch of like executive decisions about what do we do with this person, like we can't fix him, we can't, so because their hospital is there to treat people and then let them go, and then but he ends up becoming an advocate and letting him stay and live there. But there's this element, there's this moment where he says, after he realizes that when they both hear him quoting the Psalms and they realize that he can speak and that he has understanding and he is essentially cognitively normal. And then John Gielgud's character is just like staring out the window and he says, can you imagine what kind of a life he's lived for 20 years with full understanding of what has happened to him? And there are these little moments where each of the characters who are trying to understand Merrick, like get glimpses into the life that he's had, but can never fully understand it. And even the little glimpses just like break them. And that's kind of what the film does for the audience as well. But on the flip side of that, there's also Merrick and Merrick's desire to know what it's like to be a normal person, because that is a life that he has never known. And he's trying to grasp what it's like to not be stared at when you go out. He's trying to grasp what it's like to go to the theater like a normal person, what it's like to, have conversations and tea and, do all these things. Like even just like combing his hair is kind of a magnificent action for him.
I was so proud of him in that moment, which by the way is good filmmaking if you feel proud of a character for getting to groom themselves for the first time.
Right.
My God, kudos to the few strands of hair just hanging on his head. They're
Fighting
working
for their life. Yeah.
So yeah, they're doing the Lord's work.
But those two sides of it is like him trying to understand how everyone else lives, and the other people who are trying to understand how he lives. That's that kind of that understanding, that misunderstanding, trying to form a cohesion from both sides. But that culminates in his death, and in his actual death, in the way that he, spoilers, this is a sad movie. They're all sad movies. But in the way that he lays down and wants to just sleep like normal people. And this is a true part of the story. And there's a quote from Treves's book, memoir, biography. Not sure exactly what kind of book it is. But he says, he often said to me that he wished he could lie down to sleep like other people. He must, with some determination, have made the experiment. Thus it came about that his death was due to the desire that had dominated his life, the pathetic but hopeless desire to be like other people. And so there's that element of trying to understand what it's like to be a normal person, that, you know, he wanted that understanding so badly that he was willing to die for it. And the film depicts that moment in a really beautiful, achingly beautiful final scene. Yeah, it's so sad, but it's also kind of a moment of dignity for him, which is, again, part of his journey, is just like maybe a step too far, but it is him kind of fully acknowledging his dignity as a full human.
Yeah. He does get this chance to live as a human with dignity for some time before he dies. And his death, as far as I know, if I recall correctly, is through natural causes, most likely from a development of his complex condition.
No, it's literally from him laying down and putting his head down, like it was in the film.
Yeah. But he, I think also, although I don't think they didn't show it in the movie, he does get to go to the theater. No, they did show the theater.
Yeah, they did.
Which was a very incredible scene. That was a very nice looking stage play. They really conveyed the fantasy of it really well. And then I believe
that was David Lynch doing his surrealist thing for at least a little bit of this movie.
But he also did a tour of Europe. So he got to travel and meet other gentry around Europe over the course of his life, if only for a brief time. I think only like maybe the last 6 years of his life or so are spent in Treves's and the hospital's care, which is sad considering how much of his life was spent being what he was at the start of the movie. But, you know, he did get some niceness and kindness and empathy in his life. So that's nice too. And he still exists now, almost in our imaginations and our understandings, and is influencing our understanding of humanity and empathy. And, you know, I would like to think, although, you know, we don't know too much about the man's actual personality from this point in time, looking backwards, but I would like to think that he would find value in his story encouraging empathy in future generations.
Yeah.
So I think that I like that idea. And so I'm going to go with it. It's a nice idea that, you know, even though he suffered so much, the fact that his story might prevent some suffering in the future for other people is a nice thought. Yeah.
And it's so interesting that his is basically the only case that's ever been documented that's like that, is that it almost turns him into a fable in himself. Like, it's so singular as to be like an archetype in itself in a strange kind of way.
Yeah. Yeah. It's yeah. I don't know. Now I'm sad again.
Okay, well, last thing here, again, speaking about how the spectacle influences the film. This is David Lynch. He's a surrealist director, and he puts his film in black and white. And I was kind of wondering what the effect of that is. You know, do you think that it adds more of like a leaning into kind of a horror element, because there's kind of like almost makes it fall in a tradition of like the monster movies of the past, or is it kind of an element of sympathy? Like it's almost masking the full revelation of what this disease looks like. Like it's not trying to wallow in the aesthetic of the disease, but it's kind of, it's putting a little bit of a screen over it with the black and white.
Yeah, a little bit. I think some part of the consideration for the black and white does have to do with the makeup on John Hurt. Mm-hmm. I think one, it certainly makes it look more dramatic. And two, I think putting it in black and white does make it look more realistic in a sense.
Like almost more historical?
More historical to one degree, but also I think if just like stick with me here, this came out in like what, 1980? Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. So think about what was popular with heavy face makeup at the time. Horror movies, sci-fi movies, big heavy face makeup would be kind of leaning into the idea of aliens or fantasy monsters or something like that. Like think about heavily made up aliens in like Star Trek. They all have heavy like, you know, especially like the Ferengi or something like that, or the big butt heads in the first episode, the pilot episode of Star Wars, or not Star Wars, Star Trek.
Star Wars 2 with the Cantina Band
was in Technicolor. These hyper real, hyper saturated colors. They played to the fantasy. They played to the ridiculous elements of it all. And as good as that makeup was, it did have a certain look in that light that didn't quite look realistic. So I think if nothing, even if this wasn't part of the intent, I think putting it in black and white removes it from the other heavily made up faces you would have seen with fantasy makeup that were in theaters around the same time, and kind of grounded it in this grittier London street, more realistic setting, which is part of the point of the movie. You don't want to look at the Elephant Man and think that's an alien or that's a monster, even though that might be one of the first thoughts in your mind if you did encounter John Merrick in real life and didn't have any other previous information about him. But
yeah, I would probably counter that the black and white almost puts it in line with like Universal monster movies. And so
I'm just thinking
it
more
could go
of like
both either way.
What people would have been watching in
at the time.
At the time. Or you know what, if it was like, oh, we want this to look like Boris Karloff Frankenstein made up face, then maybe they were going for, we want this to look like a classic movie monster. And that's going to be your first impression of him until you hear him speak and discover his humanity.
Yeah.
So it could have been either one. I definitely think that to some degree, keeping it in black and white makes him look less goofy than he otherwise would have. But also makes the form of his head look much more specific. I think they only show his head really in this movie, but if you look up John Merrick, you can see like images of his whole body.
There are moments where they show him like the top part of him at least, with all the
he's got
and stuff.
The overgrown masses everywhere.
Yeah.
So it's all over him. So yeah, it's interesting because you essentially are making up a character who would otherwise look like a Hollywood movie monster, but you're very intentionally don't want his characterization to be that.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's interesting, but it's also part of the intent of the movie, I think, is to start at that place with the audience and then move away from it, from monster to curiosity to human who's suffering.
Yeah. All right. Well, I want to leave us with this quote that I found on Merrick's Wikipedia page, which is apparently something he would use to end his letters. adapted from an Isaac Watts poem. But he would write on his letters, "'Tis true my form is something odd, but blaming me is blaming God. Could I create myself anew, I would not fail in pleasing you. If I could reach from pole to pole or grasp the ocean with a span, I would be measured by the soul. The mind's the standard of the man." And I think the film does a really good job of kind of encapsulating the heart of that poem.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's a good idea. That's a good thought. And is hopeful in a way that some of the scenes in the movie are not.
Yeah.
But yes. Anyway, let's move on to a different kind of sadness with 2019's The Farewell. Jason, take it away.
The Farewell from 2019. While struggling to get her writing career off the ground and drowning in bills required to live in New York, Billy learns from her parents that her grandmother, Nene, who lives in Changchun, China, has been diagnosed with terminal lung cancer and is predicted to only have a few months left to live. She also learns that Nene doesn't know about her condition, and the family is planning to keep it a secret and stage a fake wedding for her cousin as an excuse to gather the extended family to see Nene one last time. While in China with her family for this final farewell, Billy struggles to reconcile her instinct to tell Nene the truth so that she can openly express the sadness she feels to her, while also learning to honor the common practices and methods of grieving in her family's native culture.
Alex, I haven't looked into this, but what is Awkwafina's claim to fame? Why does she get a single name title?
I know that she's a comedian, but I don't remember why she's. Oh, that's right. She's yeah, that's right. Her original she used to be a YouTuber, YouTube rapper, and her rap name was Awkwafina. Well,
there you go. Okay.
Man, I haven't seen that in a minute. I forgot about that. It's from like early 2010s.
Old school.
But yeah, her real name is her birth name is Nora Lum. But her screen name, everything she's credited under is Awkwafina, which from a purely branding perspective makes sense if you already have fame with one name to kind of stick with that. And then kind of build the brand up around that. Because, people already know it, especially if it's something that's out of the ordinary, like Awkwafina.
Yeah.
Because then you're going to remember it.
Well, she did a good job. But yeah, since we're talking about the spectacle, this film is like the complete opposite of the style from The Elephant Man. This film is bright and beautiful and reflective and, again, in kind of thinking through how it plays on the themes of the film. It almost plays like a rose-colored memory of a really special time that you would look back on. That's kind of how it feels.
I think the movie does have big themes around the preciousness and the beauty of being alive, even in those mundane moments, and especially in the fondness and the meaning, the significant meaning that memories have in our life, and making memories have in our life, and especially just because of the nature of the plot of the movie, but also significantly theme-wise, of making those memories with family and how those memories impact us even when we're far away from them, both in terms of time and space.
Yeah. Yeah. And of course, the misunderstanding in this one is pretty clear, and it's
intentional.
It's very well. Okay, so there's the two misunderstandings.
It's called lying.
One misunderstanding is called lying, which is a intentional obscuration of understanding, or hiding of an understanding. But then there's also the cultural.
Jonathan, you explain that like somebody who lies a lot.
Oh yeah. That's exactly.
That was way too diplomatic.
It's not lying. It's the intentional obfuscation of a truth. This is the cultural misunderstanding. The trying to understand a different, broader cultural psychological phenomenon, which is the perennial East versus West, communal versus individualistic point of view that kind of are clashing here in this film.
And very specifically with the idea of being within one person, because it's not like somebody who's entirely Western like you or I. It's like it's about a story about first or second generation immigrants.
Yeah.
And people who know both cultures, have been immersed in both, and are trying to reconcile themselves with kind of like these contradictory elements. And when do I embrace one? When do I embrace the other? This culture tells me that doing this is wrong, and this culture tells me doing this is right. And I have my family telling me this from one side and this from the other. And it's very, they do a very good job in the movie of painting a picture of how like splintering on one's ego that can be.
Yeah.
And like trying to reconcile yourself with those different aspects and how challenging that can be, which is nice because it's a very, not that it's a nice experience, it's very clearly a challenging one, but it's a very common experience for lots of people, especially in America, but it's also one that a lot of people in America have almost no experience with, like you or I. So it's does a good job of painting that and kind of like being creating a certain accessible empathy for it for people who are do not have firsthand experience with that.
And there's also an element that I think is important in that it's not at all a moral issue, right? It's a difference of approach, but it's not necessarily like one is right and one is wrong, or one is, it's not a moral thing. It's just here's how we're going to go about this. Well, I don't want to go about it that way. I want to go about it this way. Well, too bad. Because I kind of love the fact that in this film, the American girl does not get her way. Because I know there are a lot of these like culture clash movies, and it usually ends with like the more Americanized person kind of winning the day on the kind of societal side, where it's like, oh, now I understand why the individualist point of view is correct. But that's not really where this film ends. It's more just her having to come to terms with the way that her family and her historical culture typically deals with this. Even going back to her grandmother, who they're lying to in the first place, has done this for her own family. And there are little glimpses where I feel like the grandma might know, and she's just going along with it. But they don't really delve into that.
Right? Like, presumably, if she lied to her parents or husband, I don't remember which, about them being sick before they died, then
you kind of come to expect it, right?
You kind of know that, like, oh, I'm not feeling well, and I'm going to all these doctor's visits, but everyone's telling me it's okay, but I might be dying. But also, I will say, Jonathan, when you're 80 something and I have to assume that every time you get sick, you kind of have that, you might be dying thought in your head. Not to be too dark or grim about it, but like, it's just getting close to time. And so, it is understandable. And that also brings up another interesting, I think, philosophical point that's maybe like a lesser theme in the movie. Like, it's not the forefront of the theme because it's definitely more about the internal conflict of the character. But on a broader scale, like, it does kind of indirectly present the question, if you were really sick and you only had 6 months to live, would you want to know or not?
Well, just ask Akira Kurosawa. I was just thinking that's literally how the movie begins. The doctor lies to him about his condition, which now I'm realizing is way more common. I thought that was kind of just a mean doctor in Akiru, but apparently that's just how it goes. Even though that's Japanese, I understand it's different cultures, but we're kind of, they even presented in this film as like a broader East versus West kind of a conversation. But yeah, I mean, that's the flip side of that is Akiru, where it's like, he knew he had 6 months to live, and it made a difference in how he lived those 6 months.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And even then, like, there's the question of, like, you know, depending on the person, would that person do something differently if they knew? Like, Akiru was definitely like a hyperbolic example of this guy who had done nothing his whole life and very specifically had this casus belli they championed at the end of his life, and it became this very meaningful story. But, you know, would this... Do you think the grandma in this movie would do something really different if she only had 6 months left to live? Or do you think she would just keep, if she knew that, or if,
yeah,
or do you think she would keep doing what she's doing?
No, it's a good point, because I think that the difference here is that the grandma is very content with her life. Like, she exudes kind of a joy for life already. She is living in a way that our protag from Ikiru was not. Like, she is living to the fullest. And yeah, it's great that basically what they did for her might just be the best things. Like, just let her see all of her family, because that's all she really wants, is to just be with her family and have a good time with them. And that's kind of what they give her.
The young couple who's basically getting married.
Oh yeah. I'm like,
as a way to basically have a still living wake for the not yet dead grandma. That has big, like, Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn watching their own funeral vibes is fascinating and hilarious, and a weird, awkward bright spot in an otherwise very sad movie. This one is heartbreaking, but it also is very bittersweet.
Yeah,
because and I think that's intentional, because it's not like, I think if a younger person had been the person dying in the movie, it would have been
very different,
super duper tragic. It would have been a different kind of tragedy. But this, in this film, and with a woman, the grandma being as old as she is, it feels like a natural conclusion to her life. And that is a sad thing, because the people who love her will no longer have her around. But also, it's a happy thing to conclude a happy life in a happy way, because no life can go on forever. And there might be a bit of opinion in that, but I think it's a very positive outlook. And I think there's an element of that in the film too, of like, hey, you know, everybody does have to die eventually. What would be the best way to spend the last 6 months of your life? Anyway, would be enjoying the things you already enjoy. Like you were talking about, how she enjoys being around her family, and how her family have kind of tried to create that for her by bringing everybody together.
Yeah. You know what this also is? Now I'm just like making a lot of connections I wasn't thinking of before, but it's also like a very positive flip side of Tokyo Story, because in Tokyo Story, the whole crux of it is that the mom is trying to see all of her family. I don't remember if she knew that she was dying or not, but basically they're all too busy for her, and they're living their own lives, and they don't have time to hang out with their mom. And then after she's gone is when they start to kind of have that remorse and reconciliation, which again is a difference in when the discovery moment happens. But here it's like the family is very busy, and again, in Tokyo Story, the mom has to travel just across Japan to go visit her family. But here, like, her family has dispersed across the globe. She has a son in Japan. She has a son in America. But they realize that they want to be with their mom before she passes. And so they make the trip to come and be with her. And so it is kind of this positive flip side of the coin from the tragedy that is similar in context to Tokyo Story.
Yeah. And that's one of the interesting things too. I think it's why it's so bittersweet, is because there are inter-character conflicts that are honestly very normal family-based inter-character conflicts. There's some internal character conflicts, but there's nobody doing something
mean
or bad over the course of the movie. Everybody kind of like to a certain extent, in A Woman Under the Influence, everybody does want the best for each other. Of course, they're not as destructive in trying to do that as they are in A Woman Under the Influence, for obvious reasons. But even though they don't know what the correct answer is at the start, I think they do, it is a very honestly positive story about a family struggling with something that's very common and relatable and tragic in its own way, the losing of an older loved one, and getting through that together as a family. So it is sad because it's so relatable and you're losing somebody, but it also is kind of a very positive display of a family coming together to get through a hard time.
Yeah. And there are a lot of elements. They do a good job of like making this feel like a real family, because there are a lot of things that are kind of alluded to outside of the scope of the story. Like she alludes to the fact that her parents have had fights in the past and her dad has had problems with alcohol in the past. And those all kind of like poke their head up, even though they're not delved into. And even just the fact that we have no clue how the couple that's getting married feels about this whole thing where they're fake getting married, or maybe they are actually getting married, like they rushed it just for this. I don't actually know what the deal was, because now what are they gonna have to get married again? Are they gonna break up? Like, what do you do after this? But it doesn't matter. Oh
man, that would be so terrible if they did, and they spent so much money on that.
So spoilers, at the end of the film they're like, grandma lived another 6 years after we told her this lie. So it's like this couple has either broken up or probably gotten married within those 6 years. Like, what happened after that? How are you going to break that to grandma 3 years later when they break up? Do you call it a divorce, or do you just tell her that you lied or hope she forgot? I don't know. But where was I going with that? Oh yeah, but the point of that, the all those loose ends mean that the film is very squarely focused on Awkwafina. We spend so much time just kind of getting through her conflicting emotions, and we're not wasting time on all the other like questions that go along with this whole thing. But I think part of that is that that grief journey is kind of a journey of understanding in itself, right? It's like she has to reconcile this new element of life, this new element being introduced into the status quo. It's a uncomfortable and unwelcome new element, which is that grandma's going to be gone. And so her just trying to incorporate that into her current understanding of what her life is, what her family is. Because there's also a lot of elements of her own life that are kind of left up in the air. Like she doesn't have enough money. She doesn't know what she's going to do with her career and stuff like that. And so she's trying to cope with all of these unknowns. And now we're adding in this element of, and grandma's not going to be there. And did I spend enough time with her? Do I need to stay with her here? And she's kind of grappling with all of these things. And so that is a journey of understanding in itself, just within her character.
Yeah. Does she go through the 5 stages? I'm trying to think. Are there like the distinct 5 stages of grief in this movie? I don't remember what the 5 stages of grief actually are in order. So I have to like Google that. 1 second.
There's
denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance.
Did she do? Oh, I guess she does. So I think bargaining is, well, I'll just stay here with her.
Yeah. Yeah. She does get angry at her family. She definitely gets depressed and sad and cries.
Yeah.
And then at the end, there is acceptance.
I think she does. Yeah.
Yeah.
So there you go.
There you have it. Yeah. She almost makes a really big life decision when she's like, I'm moving back to China.
Yeah, I know.
It's like, are you? What are you going to do?
Not even back. She's never lived there before.
I thought she grew up there. And then she moved, because there was this story where she was talking about them.
They moved when she was like 2 or 3.
Moved when she was really tiny.
Yeah.
But yeah.
That's right. But yeah, but
so she's like,
there's the whole thing of like her and her cousin barely speak Chinese.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's one of those really common, like, first and a half generation immigrant experiences where you go to visit your family and you're expected to know the language, but you don't necessarily know the language. Or if you do know the language, you don't know it as well as them because you didn't grow up immersed in it, and maybe you don't have the right accent and all that stuff.
Yeah,
so there's this language divide with people who are you're supposedly supposed to be like close to, and that's like disconcerting and odd and uncomfortable. So yeah,
and it's a hard thing. I mean, we have some friends who are both I think second generation Korean, and they're teaching their kids like Korean first, which is interesting to watch, and it's like a hard thing to do, right? If it's like you're in this bubble of the home teaching one language, and then I assume that English gets picked up by assimilation at the same time, but it's a hard thing to carry on a tradition like that outside of a cultural context.
Yeah, I know a guy up here who's from Germany, and he's trying to make sure that his young daughter is learning German. So she's going to German school. She's like three or four, and she's been going to German school and learning German at home and speaking English at just like out and about because she's not old enough to actually be in school. But just so that, you know, she can interact with her dad in his native language and interact with her grandparents in their native language. You know, because he can speak English, but grandma and grandpa are not as good at it, I would think. So, you know, just that way to like kind of develop closeness, because, you know, family you immediately assume is a close bond, but it's not necessarily. So anything that I think reveals the lack of a guarantee of a close bond that is a family relationship, like not being able to speak the same language, it can be, I think, a challenge for people, and certainly disconcerting for others, especially if you place a really high value on being connected to extended family. So it's interesting, and it's a very common thing, especially in the modern world where everyone's immigrated and, you know, interconnected and global and all that stuff, you know, for people to experience. So anything that kind of touches on that is very relatable, I think. Yeah.
All right. Well, hopefully that's a little bit of, like I said, a bittersweet ending to the series, is at least not a complete downer. But anything else on the farewell before we move into overall?
No, just time to say farewell.
Time to say farewell. Also, a fitting conclusion to the series, the farewell. But yeah, speaking of languages, I guess, I think part of like a core element of this episode, and also just of life, is that understanding comes from communication, right? So the less communication there is, the more misunderstanding there is. And so in each of these films, there's some amount of this could be solved if we just talked. And it sounds like really basic, but these problems happen every single day in tiny and big ways, just because people don't want to say things out loud to each other for various reasons, or don't know how, there's like even there's the very beginning of A Woman Under the Influence, when he ends up having to take a late shift, and he doesn't call his wife, and he's been talking about like, I gotta get home. We have this date night tonight. And then he takes this other shift, and his buddy's like, aren't you gonna call her and like just tell her? And she's sitting there like freaking out, and we don't even know that like how deeply this is going to affect her. And it takes him like hours to call, just because he's like, well, what am I gonna say? That I let you down, that I like. So there's part of that miscommunication is like, again, goes back to a guilt, or it goes back to a self-consciousness of, well, I just have to say something very uncomfortable out loud. And that's often the case with what you have to do in order to avoid certain types of miscommunications and certain types of tragedies.
Yeah, you just have to get comfortable saying uncomfortable things out loud, like moist.
All right, well, now that we officially have no listeners. Well, yeah, but I think taking that concept and broadening it out, insofar as stories themselves are a form of communication, these films are themselves a means to help the audience understand others in the world that they will encounter. So it's kind of like we've already been touching on this a little bit, but these stories are kind of in a sense like flexing our pity muscles. Like they're flexing our capacity for sympathy and for empathy. And in that sense, even if we've never met someone like John Merrick, because frankly, literally no one else on earth has met someone like John Merrick. But these films give us a capacity and like, okay, I have a context, I have a category for how to interact with a person who looks differently than I would expect, or a person who acts and behaves in a way that I would not expect or would not necessarily want them to, or I have an understanding of a certain way to approach a culture that I've not fully integrated into my daily life, or all these things are just little parcels that give us the tools to approach situations that we may encounter in the future.
Yeah. I mean, but that's one of the reasons why we watch or engage with stories in the first place, right? Is to flex those emotional muscles of a various kind. Besides just entertainment, why would anyone watch or read or play anything sad in the first place if there wasn't some sort of emotional satisfaction in experiencing empathy?
Yeah.
And I say that rather than sadness, because I do think there is an inherent natural like dopamine response to experiencing empathy and connection with another person, even if they're fictional or based on a real person, but still fictional within the bounds of the movie. So I think there is a value there. I think it isn't maybe the most appealing thing to people. So it's why, the bulk of movies aren't tragedies, because that would be sad. But there is a reason that these are still made and still meaningful and still experienced and watched by lots of people.
And I would even use the word edificial in like a really technical sense. Like, to build an edifice is to like
edifice
is to build a structure or something with walls and substance. Like, it's building it's building categories. It's building a buffer between us and these kinds of situations, or a foundation for us to put our own experiences on top of. Ding, ding, ding. A challenger appears, Alex. So.
Yes.
A challenger appears.
Is it 60-year-old Mike Tyson? I don't know if you get that reference.
I don't know how that fight turned out, but I know that there was
good.
A thing for Tyson.
It was a sorry experience for everybody involved.
Okay. Yeah, I know the general context. No, even better. It is 2,000-year-old Plato. So Aristotle, who we've been basing this series on, was a student of Plato. And he wrote the Poetics almost in spite of Plato. So Plato has dedicated basically the entire...
It was a diss track?
It was basically a diss track to Plato.
Whoa, watch out, Kendrick.
But it was in kind, because Plato does a lot of dissing of his own. The last book of the Republic is dedicated to poetry and why poetry and art and all creative acts are basically useless. So we started the series talking about how Aristotle acknowledges that art is imitation, an imitation of life and things that happen in life. That was a response to Plato's argument that because art is imitation, it is therefore less valuable than the thing that it is imitating. And so Plato's contention is that if Homer was so great at imitating these actions of state and warfare and all these kinds of things, why didn't he go out and do them? Why wasn't he a great general? Why didn't he start a city-state or a philosophical school? All he could do was write about them. So Plato was like throwing Homer and throwing all these other artists under the bus and saying that their art is essentially useless or less good than the reality of that which they are imitating. And Aristotle was like, hold up, I still think that there's some use to this. And I don't know that anyone still holds to like a strictly Platonic view of arts like that, at least not in the popular culture. But it is an interesting thing just to throw in here, at the end of this series, that there is a school of thought that says you should go out and live your life worthy of being told about in stories, rather than spending it writing stories or experiencing stories themselves, insofar as they are imitations of what is actually real.
I do think, I will always say that art has value. I think that maybe we talked about this, I think, a few times over the course of this series, but I think we might have hit the other end of the extreme culturally, where people are only experiencing empathy and complex emotions through art rather than experiencing them in real life that frequently.
It definitely gives some weight to Plato's argument.
Where it's like, yes, I know we're almost like drowning in art in our day and age, both good and bad.
Yeah.
And it's just an endless stream of it, which on the one hand is very exciting and awesome and cool to have so much access to really cool, inventive storytelling, interactive or visual or literary, but also it can't be your end all be all for experiencing the world. I mean, I guess I can't really say it can't, but I would say it maybe isn't healthy for that to be your end all be all. But of course, also like think about, and of course, this is an extreme case that doesn't justify, most people's experience of it. But think about somebody like Joseph Merrick. Like he's only going to be able to experience so much in his life. But, if he goes to the theater or if he goes and reads a bunch of books, he'll be able to experience more than he otherwise would have.
Mm-hmm. I think Plato would say that as long as he is living out like the virtues that you would get from those artistic experiences, insofar as that is part of his life, it is superior to necessarily, having to experience those things through artistic endeavors. Yeah.
And obviously Merrick is a special case.
Yeah.
Most people should probably have a healthy mix of both. It's kind of, I think it's maybe a bit of an erroneous argument to argue whether lived or experience or high quality art is the healthiest thing for you. It feels like arguing about whether or not you should eat more fruits or more vegetables. It's like both are good for you and you should have both in a healthy, balanced amount. But, also can't get in the way of those ancient philosophical diss tracks.
Yeah.
So,
and to your point, though, the problem of experiencing life too much through art is not a new one. I mean, that is the entire theme of the giant tome that is Don Quixote, right? Is that he experienced all his knowledge of the world through romances and went out to go and live it, but he did not experience the real world as it was. He experienced it as he saw it through romantic literature.
Read too many fanfics online of what a knight was supposed to be and went and tilted a windmill.
Exactly. And that's why that story is so has so much lasting power, because we still do that. People are still obsessed with movies, and there's so many quixotic stories these days about people who just watch movies for their whole life and then they go out and try to live their life like a movie. Doesn't usually work out too good.
Yeah, you're not actually. I mean, I guess yes, everyone's the protagonist of their own life, but nobody's actually writing your life. Nobody has a 3-act structure for it. That's not how reality happens. So, yeah.
In microcosms, it does, but
yeah. Watch movies, but not too many of them, please.
Watch movies and go live your life. That should be our tagline.
Yeah. But yes. Okay, what are we talking about next time on the podcast, Jonathan?
Well, it is December. It is the end of this series of tragedy episodes. We're going to take a break in January, as is our wont these days with the series structure. And we'll be back in February as the two-hander to the tragedy series. We're going to wrap up this discussion with a series on comedy, which will hopefully be a little bit more enjoyable and less sad, hopefully. But yeah, Basically, what it's going to be is, because I think comedy is a little more specific to cultural norms in terms of what makes comedies work. There are obviously universal aspects, but we're going to take a look specifically at the history of comedy films in American cinema. And we're going to kind of go through where they started in film and where they are now in film. And it'll be very interesting because we've kind of touched throughout the way, and we've kind of derided some modern comedy films. We've looked at some modern comedy films that we really like. And we're going to see where all that comes from, starting with The Silent Clowns when we come back in February.
It's going to be hysterical. But yes, there you go. There you have it. That's what we're doing next year. But that's about all the time we have for this episode.
To find links to things that we talked about today, as well as a complete list of past episodes and all 510 films we've covered so far, visit thefilmlings.com.
You can also join us for ongoing film discussions on our Discord server.
And to stay posted about upcoming episodes, follow us at The Filmlings.
This episode's summaries were recorded by me, Blue Jay. You can discover everything I do at thebluejayproject.com.
If you like the show, let us know. Leave us a review on iTunes so other people will know what we're all about.
We definitely appreciate it.
Talk to you next time.
All right, see ya. You son of a gun. Say that like ASMR, because some people will turn us off immediately.
Moist.
Probably including my wife.
Ha ha ha. Drive them away with moistness.
Ugh.
Moisture? I think it's moisture, not moistness.
Moistity.
Moistity.